right, so welcome everyone. My name is Jason Lambert. I'm here with my co-presenter and co-author Dio Akinlade, and today we're going to discuss navigating microaggressions for technical professionals. This is an interactive workshop, and we ask that you remain muted until the end. But if we do have time, we have some opportunities to participate in the chat. You can unmute when asked to do so, and please save your questions until the end.
Okay, so what we're going to do today, we're going to look at microaggressions. We all hear about microaggressions, but what are microaggressions? Why do they happen? What are the implications of microaggression? And then we'll talk about some strategies for addressing microaggressions in the workplace. So when you think of a people, what image comes to mind? This or this? For me, it's this. And why is that? Next slide, please. It's because usually when I hear about people's, what comes to mind are things I've read in the media. You know, a people attacked a baby, a 5-year-old boy, or another dog, or they're threatening. They are people are fleeing from them. They can kill people. They can kill dogs, etc. So when I think of people's, what comes to mind are things like aggressive, attacker, killer, threatening. So every people I meet, these are the words that come into my mind. They're aggressive, they can attack me, they can kill me. Now, meet Rory. Rory is actually one of my previous students' pitbull. But the minute I hear the word pitbull, what comes to mind is threatening, aggressive, attacker, a killer. Even though Rory is actually very loyal, very protective, very gentle, and projecting those attributes onto Rory. And that's what happens with unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is when we have these automatic associations between certain attributes and behaviors and members of an identity group. And this leads to stereotyping. We overgeneralize these attributes and behaviors to every single member of that identity group. And this can result in microaggressions. So microaggressions are indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against a marginalized group. They often reflect our unconscious bias, and they tend to perpetuate stereotypes. They convey demeaning messages and can create a hostile work environment with feelings of exclusion for the members of the minority group and amplify inequity in an organization. So, for example, being expected to be the spokesperson for all members of a particular identity group, not appreciating the fact that just because you are Black does not mean that you speak for everybody and that you have your own unique perspective on a topic or a situation. Another example is anglicizing your name. So you have a foreign name and people wanting to shorten it because it's too difficult to pronounce. So microaggressions are like, somebody described, there's a really cute video on YouTube and it likens it to mosquito bites. So you have the one bite is okay, you know, on its own, it doesn't seem that serious, okay? But then you have all these series of bites, and that's when it becomes a problem. And that's really the problem with microaggression. It's when you have all this series of insults that may be subtle on their own, But when they come together, when they occur together and every day, then it becomes a problem. So Dr. Chester Pierce, who's one of the first people that first coined the phrase microaggression, he says this eloquently. He says, even though any single offense can be relatively innocuous, the cumulative effect to the victim and to the victimizer is of an unimaginable magnitude. And that's the key with microaggressions. So, for example, somebody says you're very articulate. My son, when he first went to college, people would say he was very articulate, and it sounds like a compliment. But then they didn't say the same thing to his friends who graduated from the same high school as him and spoke in exactly the same way. So, in other words, they're saying that he's articulate for a Black person, that Black people are not expected to be articulate. It could include things like, oh, can I touch your hair? Where are you really from? Almost as if you're an alien in this country, even though you were born and raised here. Saying that's too difficult for you, expecting you not to be able to achieve certain levels or not be able to take on certain projects because they don't think you are capable. It also includes things like, can you click, please, Jason? Mispronouncing your names, ignoring your input, because you're a racial minority, banning hairstyles, gaslighting, or as if you are the problem if you bring up issues. Tone policing as well are just examples of microaggressions. So the implications of microaggressions is that it's very challenging. So it's difficult to identify and address because it's so subtle and vague. So, for example, it's easier to go up to your boss and say, oh, somebody called you a racial slur, right? But it's very difficult to convince them that there's an issue if you say somebody said you were very articulate. So that's one of the issues with microaggressions. Quite often they're innocent. The person may not know that they're doing or saying something wrong. And but for the victim, it's still very visible and very oppressive. And sometimes victims are reluctant to bring it up because people might think they're being too sensitive. The research has shown that the accumulation of microaggressions can lead to health problems. And in fact, they're more psychologically damaging than the direct forms of discrimination. I think part of this is because it's easier to identify and deal with the more overt forms of discrimination. It tends to have a negative impact on employees' relationships at work and their job outcomes as well.
Yeah, and Dio, one example that I want to bring up is that I remember when I was in school, some professors would come up to me and ask me why other Black students wore their pants hanging down, or they'd say that I'm moving on up like the Jeffersons. And those were what we call micro insults because they thought that they were genuine in asking me these questions, not realizing that they were placing a stereotype, assumptions, and stigmatizing a group to which I belong to, being African American. Also, at the same time, they were treating me as if I spoke on behalf of all Black people as a monolith. So during my when I was completing my doctorate, a lot of those things led to some health problems psychologically. My hair fell out. I encountered had some negative health implications because of that. And so I firsthand understand how microaggressions over time, when they build up, just like those mosquito bites, can really impact your health. So translate that into the workplace. Employees feel the same way and might be less engaged at work, etc. So next, what we're going to do is talk about how do we address microaggressions. So we've learned about what microaggressions are, the different types, and we've learned about some examples. But what we usually don't understand is how do I address it if I am a victim of a microaggression? Because of the fact that it could be subtle, it could be overlooked if we report it to our peers or our managers, and so sometimes we don't know how to respond. We don't know if we should respond. And so when we address microaggressions, the first thing we want to do is be mindful. And so we want to ask questions about our environment, about the situation, to make sure that we have a clear head. Because when we experience a microaggression, it is a sensitive nature, it is offensive, and it's very easy for us to have an emotional response, and that's okay. But we want to ask ourselves these questions: if I respond, could my physical safety be in danger? If I respond, will the person become defensive, or can this lead to an argument? Do I know this person well? Right. And so if this is someone who I know very well, how will it affect my relationship? If this person is an employee I work with, or my boss, or if it's a stranger, that might determine if we decide we want to address the microaggression as well. Ask yourself, if you don't respond, will you regret not saying something? Because that's important too. Because what you don't want to do is think back uh, and think about what you could have done or what you should have done, because now there's some residual effects, residual emotional effects from that experience when you experience this microaggression from the perpetrator. And also, if you don't respond, what does that mean? How will they perceive your lack of response? Will that convey that you accept the behavioral statement? So these are some questions that we want to be mindful about and ask when we encounter a microaggression. We also have here, Dr. Nadell developed a toolkit that basically talks about some of these steps of how we respond to microaggressions, including asking some of these questions that I just listed here. So when we talk about microaggressions, we've come up with a framework based on all of the research that's out there. And that framework is called micro. So it's easy to remember. So with micro, first we want to make the invisible visible. And that's what the M stands for. So it's okay to challenge the stereotype, right? Call it out what it is. Also, ask people to clarify what they meant. So if you encounter someone who maybe asks you if they can touch your hair, ask, well, why do you think you want to touch my hair? Why do you want to touch my hair? Or do you think that's okay or appropriate to touch someone's hair? Because maybe they don't realize that that's a microaggression. So give them an opportunity to either apologize or rephrase what they may have meant. Next, the I is for intentionality. And you want to try and understand not only the intentions of the person exhibiting the microaggression, but also what are your own intentions. So when we think about intentions for self, is your intent to address the microaggression to educate the individual on microaggressions or what they've done, or is it to express anger? And it's okay if you want to do either of those things, but you want to kind of know where what approach you're using, because there are going to be consequences for whichever approach that you use. We try to advocate, tell people to first. If you want to express or address the microaggression, to do it from a place of educating the other individual, because to reduce or mitigate any conflict, and to also hopefully teach that individual something new so that the next person won't be a recipient of a microaggression from that person. But again, I want to reiterate, it's okay to express feelings of anger or discomfort, because your feelings are truly validated. Just make sure that those questions of, are you in a safe place? Is there possibility for physical harm? Those questions are asked if you choose that approach. And then the attention of others. Is this person really seeking, advice, or did they really make a mistake? Or after you address the microaggression, do you see that they're apathetic to it? That they really don't care that they exhibited a microaggression, or maybe they try to debate with you about whether or not that microaggression truly was something that that harmed you. And it's important for them to understand, and you can articulate this to them that it doesn't matter what their intention is, but it still has the same harmful effect. And then again, different microaggressions, some are very explicit, and these are micro assaults because you can very visibly see that there was some intent behind what was said. And some are implicit, which might be micro insults, um, or micro invalidations. And those that are implicit, based on implicit bias, that the person may or may not have really intended or known what they were doing. And so that intention is important because that can also determine which approach you use. Are they open to learning about microaggressions and being educated on what they did and how it could be harmful to other people or not? The intention matters, but also so does the impact. And C is to communicate. And you want to engage in one-on-one dialogue if possible about what was offensive. And so sometimes it's not good to engage in these conversations if you're in a circle or if you're in a meeting. But after the meeting, take someone to the side and say, "Hey, I want to let you know that that statement that you said I felt was pretty offensive." And I think that most other people who are black or who belong to my identity group or who are gay or lesbian or what have you would also think that's offensive. So explain that to them. If you see in microaggression, it's okay to interrupt and redirect. For example, let's say that Sean is talking about an idea, and then I'm sorry, Julie mentions an idea, and then Sean comes in and repeats her idea and then gets credit for it. Or people say, "Hey, that's a great idea, Sean." If you're a leader, or not even if you're a leader, if you're just an ally or just another person who belongs to that identity group, like if you're another woman, it's okay to interrupt and say, "Hey, and use a micro affirmation to say, Sean, that sounds great. I'm glad that you just kind of confirmed what Julie just said. Who else has some other ideas that we can tack on to what Julie mentioned, so that we can bring that credit back to Julie, even though she was microaggressed by Sean. Uh, be able to describe what is happening so they can understand why there is a microaggression, and it's okay to express disagreement. We found that it's also good to request for assistance and support from your supervisor, or also join support groups as well, because of the mental toll and mental health implications for having these cuts, death by 1,000 cuts that we experience from microaggression. So you want to seek external reinforcement in your company, seek allies, and that'll also improve the tone and set the tone and the culture, that employees understand that we all support one another, and we're going to have low tolerance for this type of behavior and these types of interactions. And then you want to own your thoughts and feelings around the impact. And so express the impacts that it had on you, that the statement had on you, so they understand the reason why it's a microaggression. They understand the reason why it's harmful, not only to you, but to other employees in the organization as well. So own your thoughts and own your feelings. And with with this framework that we've put out here as well, it's important to recognize that everyone is not comfortable addressing microaggressions, and that's okay too. And so you really want to then skip to R and request for assistance, support, seek help from supervisors, let them know what's going on, because it's not necessarily your responsibility to educate everyone, but if you can, that's a great way to help reduce microaggressions in the workplace. So, when we talk about microaggressions, oftentimes we hear things like, well, we hear it in the dynamic of white versus black, or people of color can't exhibit microaggressions, or black people can't be racist. But, you know, I want to ask you if you can place it in the chat, can a racial minority also be a microaggressor? And unfortunately, the way this system is set up, I cannot view the chat while I'm presenting. So I'm just going to keep going and answer the question for you. That especially in the book by Ibrahim X. Kendi, that's just recently come out, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he talks about how all groups can be racist and all groups can perpetuate and experience microaggressions. We can also perpetuate intra-group microaggressions. Why? Because we are all conditioned by the same images, media, pop culture in our environment. And so we all form stereotypes, even towards our own in group, not in addition to other out groups. Then there's levels of awareness that we have based on the groups that we belong to. For example, you can be someone who's Black, African American, and maybe have stereotypes for another underrepresented racial identity group, right? And so we all need to think about how we exhibit microaggressions and how we think about our own biases as well. And then there's intersectionality, where people who belong to multiple identity groups. And so you can have someone who's Black who is a microaggressor towards a Black woman, or because of her gender or sex, or someone or a Black gay or lesbian employee because of their sexual orientation. So, due to intersectionality, all of us at some point need to check our biases to make sure that we don't exhibit microaggressions, even though we also can be the recipients of them as well. So, what do you do if you're accused of being a microaggressor? Right? And so we've talked about what happens if we experience a microaggression, but what about if we're accused of being the microaggressor? Well, first, take a deep breath, right? Because this can be an emotional thing. Because sometimes, because microaggressions, micro insults, and micro invalidations, um, those who exhibit those may not realize that they have exhibited a microaggression. May come as a shock or surprise to you, especially if you're a person of color or someone who already belongs to a marginalized group. Because sometimes we don't think that we have the capacity to exhibit microaggressions as well. So take a breath. Overlook the emotion from the accuser, because the accuser has a right to be upset, has a right to be emotional, and be open to dialogue. So think about this. If someone calls you out on it, especially if you're at work or they're a friend, someone who you know, that might mean that they trust you. And that's a good thing. And so actively listen to what the person accusing you of being a microaggressor has to say. Don't over explain yourself. Don't play the definitions game about what I meant was this, or you're defining this as that. We suggest that you just simply just apologize, because we've all learned about the golden rule, which is to treat others as one wants to be treated. Treat those how you want to be treated. But what's more important is the platinum rule, that's treating others how they want to be treated. And so recognize that, you are not the expert on this issue. You're not the person who's experienced microaggressions based on that group. So really, they have more experience and know more about it than you. And so it's good to give that benefit of the doubt, understand, listen, learn, and apologize, and treat them how they want to be treated. Um, Due to the lack of time, I think we're not going to be able to do this activity because we had technical difficulties moving in. And I want to open the floor for questions. But to summarize, microaggressions, they may or may not be intentional, and that's important to recognize, but the effects are still the same. So, although they may not be intentional, you still want to address the microaggressions, but be mindful of the context as well. All groups, irrespective of your background, can experience and perpetrate microaggressions. And remember that it's important to value all of our differences and to recognize that we all are human, right? Absolutely. So we're going to open the floor for some questions. And if you visit our website at careermentornet.com, you will also find a link to the under about what we read and what we talk about. In that link, you can find a diversity resource spreadsheet that links out to that for more information about not only microaggressions but trainings, other best practices on how to improve diversity, climate change, and enact diversity, climate change, and improve the equity and inclusion in your organization. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and hopefully, when I stop sharing, I will be able to actually I can come back and see the participation here. Okay. Interesting. Yes. So I'm reading through the chat for any questions that you might have. I'm sure Dio still can't hear me. Can you hear me still, Dio? No, she can't, unfortunately. But what we will begin to do is answer some of these questions for you. And these are some great comments, too. Some people might get hostile due to a microaggression. Kareem says that absolutely. I feel the same way. That's why it's first important to take a deep breath and be mindful first. So we don't get ourselves into too much trouble, right? Even though, like John Lewis says, we can get into good trouble. Say nothing, feel regret. Good point. Respond, be perceived as stereotypical person. It is a catch 22. And that's why when we look at the framework for micro, that R, the request assistance, is very important. So you can have a support system as well. Throwing hands if they touch my hair. That's funny. Yes, they can. So if you have any questions, please add the questions to the chat. How do you handle your anger during a situation where the aggression is very offensive? Kareem, that's a very good question, and there are different techniques for different people. But if you meditate. I know for me, I meditate regularly, and so what happens? Those who meditate know this: that when you're in stressful situations, just by beginning your meditative process, whether it's counting or breathing, you're able to quickly put yourself in a trance state because your body is now conditioned to that system, that process. And so that's one way that you can do that. Breathing techniques, counting backwards to maybe, reduce the cognitive load of that situation to think about other things. But sometimes, like we said before, you don't have to address every microaggression. And sometimes it's best to just walk away, especially if it's someone who is not responsive to you educating them on the fact that they've exhibited a microaggression towards you. Okay. How do you handle your anger during a situation? Is addressing your boss different than addressing a coworker? So that's a great question. So, there's power differential, power dynamics there. If your boss is the one that's exhibiting the microaggression, I would say that, yes, talk to your boss about that as well. Now, your culture of your organization better than I do. But if you feel too uncomfortable to address your boss, then it might be time to maybe seek employment elsewhere. But also, if your organization has employee resource groups, or sometimes some companies are creating what's known as organizational ombudsman. So they're like an ombudsman for the private sector. So someone who is impartial, someone who has a confidential process to receive feedback from employees, or even HR, that might be where you need to go. Or if you've addressed your boss, or if you don't feel like you can address your boss, you can also maybe go one step up above above your boss, and hopefully they'll be more receptive. But it depends on the situation, and context matters and is important. I'm hoping that I answered that question for you, Kareem. Is there anything you want me to elaborate on, or not? And is there anyone else who has more questions? Feel free to include them in the chat. What time is it? It's 11:50. Great. So we do have time, I think, for a few more questions. Or maybe, actually, 40. If it's 40 minutes, one more question. Okay, answered it. Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. Poll. All right. And also, I just want to mention too that on the original schedule today, we I think we were supposed to discuss microaggressions for DEI professionals in leadership in organizations. But when we logged in, we saw that the schedule had been changed. So if that's what you were looking for, we will be presenting tomorrow. Some of the content will be the same, but some of it will be different, specifically addressing how do you address leadership. As a leader, how do you address microaggressions in the workplace as well? So it's a little bit different from if you're an employee. We're going to give you some tips on how to appropriately intervene and also create a safe space for employees in your organization if you're a leader or a DEI expert.